Hello, ladies. Today we're going to be discussing the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. So as I'm talking to you today, make sure that you have your notes sheet out and you're taking notes along with me. To begin, I want to give you some background information to make this text a bit easier to understand. So we're going to begin by talking about Geoffrey Chaucer. This is the author of the Canterbury Tales. And as you can see, he lived from about 1340 to 1400 CE, or Common Era. Now, that first bullet says that Chaucer wrote in English, and this was very revolutionary for his time. At the time, the language of the upper class, the language of the government, was French. Everyone was speaking in French. And so when Chaucer decided to write the Canterbury Tales in English, this was practically unheard of. And a lot of people looked down on him for it because English was considered the language of the lower class. So it was very low class, kind of a bit strange for him to write in English, but obviously he was successful. And because he wrote in English, it really set the stage for English as a language to take off and become as popular as it is today. So without Chaucer, it's very possible that we might be speaking French today. So that next bullet says that because of this, because Chaucer wrote in English, he is considered really not one of, he's considered the father of English literature. So you can write that in and you can delete one of. He is the father of English literature. He was the first. He set the stage for what English literature is today. So we have him to thank. And that's why it's really important that we study the Canterbury Tales. Last bullet says that Chaucer was a member of the middle class. However, he worked as a page, or really basically a secretary, for the upper class. And so because of that, Chaucer has a really interesting perspective on social class. He glimpsed what the middle class was like, but he also got a glimpse of the upper class. And so we'll see that social class becomes a really important issue in the Canterbury Tales. So next I want to discuss with you the historical context of the Canterbury Tales. So this bullet tells you that the Canterbury Tales takes place in medieval England shortly after the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, which was led by Wat Tyler. And this revolt is exactly what it sounds like. The peasants in England revolted. They started rampaging the country, burning fields, all that, because they were really upset with the situation, the social situation, rather, in England. They demanded an end to serfdom, which is a servitude that's similar to slavery, and they also demanded an end to lordship. They didn't like that some people were considered better than other people. And so they really wanted to change the social class situation. Unfortunately, the peasants were unsuccessful. The Peasants' Revolt died down. It was put to rest, and nothing changed. But this just goes to show you that social class was becoming a huge issue in England, and we'll see that in the Canterbury Tales. So next, just want to give you a quick recap of what the Canterbury Tales is all about. As you read in the background information when you were reading for homework, the Canterbury Tales is about a group of pilgrims that goes on a journey to Canterbury. And they're going to Canterbury to worship at the shrine of Thomas Becket, who was a saint. And so on this journey, they are obviously a little bit bored. And so someone issues a challenge. They say to all these pilgrims on the journey, and there are about 20 of them, they say, okay, whoever can tell the most interesting story will be declared the winner. And so on this journey in the Canterbury Tales, all these pilgrims are telling these stories, trying to be the winner, the person who tells the most interesting story. And you get to read about all the stories that the characters tell. Some of them are funny, some of them are sad. And the wife of Bath and the Prioress are two of the pilgrims who are going on this journey. And so later on in the Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath tells a story, and also the Prioress tells a story. Now, in this class, we're not going to be reading any of the stories. We're just reading Chaucer's description of the wife of Bath and what she was like, and the Prioress and what she was like. We're not even going to get into the stories that they tell. So that's kind of a background regarding what's going on here. So, what is a pilgrimage? We talked about pilgrims. A pilgrimage is a religious journey, and so all these pilgrims are going on a journey with the intent of worshiping at the shrine of a saint. Next, what is a social commentary? This is something we need to know in order to understand the Canterbury Tales. This might be a new term, might not be. It says, a social commentary is when an author uses his or her work to comment critically on a flaw in his or her society. So make sure you write that definition down. This is very similar to satire. This is another literary term. Satire is a piece of literature intended to ridicule the subject of the work. The author uses humor and exaggeration or hyperbole to arouse contempt in the reader and to expose human and or societal imperfections. So make sure you take a minute to write down that definition and pause the video if you need to. Social commentary and satire are obviously very similar. They both have the same goal, which is to allow the author to criticize and comment on some of the flaws in our society. The difference is that satire really relies on humor. Satire is going to be a little bit funny, and we'll see that in the Canterbury Tales. There are definitely some things that will make you laugh. Lastly, how are paraphrases and summaries different? We talked about this already, but remember that a paraphrase is a line-by-line interpretation of the text, and a summary is a much more condensed, much more brief overview of the text. So if I have a 14-line poem, the paraphrase is going to be 14 lines, but the summary might only be, one sentence. So make sure you know the difference between those two terms. So go ahead and turn to the next page, and we're going to begin by discussing the Prioress. Now, this pre-analysis question says, what do we think a nun should be like? So before we jump into anything, we just need to reflect on what our expectations are of what a nun will look like, especially a nun in medieval England. If you're anything like me, you think of The Sound of Music, you might think of Sister Lorna when you think of nuns, and stereotypically we think of nuns as very religious, very devoted to God. We think of nuns as perhaps a little bit strict as well. They're going to follow the rules, do exactly what they're told, and a lot of times we think of nuns as not having any fun. So these are kind of the images we have in our head, and we're going to see if the Prioress in the Canterbury Tales lives up to these expectations. So you'll see right beneath this question that you have a chart, and the chart has 4 columns. There's one column with textual evidence, one that says paraphrase, one that says direct or indirect characterization, and the final one says inferences. What I want you to do is spend about 5 to 10 minutes and try filling out this chart. Now, I know that the Canterbury Tales is a difficult text, and so I've chosen 4 quotations that I think are the most important, and I want you to tackle them first. I'm going to go over them in this video, but I want to see what you can do first. So I'm going to ask you in just a minute to pause this video, put about 10 minutes on the clock, and just work your way through this. Look at the first quotation, then try to paraphrase it, write that line-by-line summary. Then decide, okay, is it direct or indirect characterization? And then finally, come up with an inference. Make an educated guess about the Prioress based on the text. So go ahead and pause the video right now, and then after 10 minutes have passed, restart this video. So let's begin working our way through these quotations. The first one says, and she spoke daintily in French extremely. French in the Paris style she did not know. So for my paraphrase, I wrote, the Prioress spoke delicate, refined French, but she doesn't know or understand the Paris version of French. Now, that's a bit interesting. I said that this was a good example of direct characterization because Chaucer is basically outright telling us what the Prioress is like, but you could possibly argue that it's indirect because we are hearing about her behaviors. Now, to analyze this a bit, it says, what is ironic about these lines? It's interesting that Chaucer says that she speaks this delicate, dainty French. He's just telling us straight up that she's delicate, dainty, knows French. But he says that she doesn't know the Paris style of French. Now, if you were to go to Paris, but you cannot speak French like the French they speak in Paris, then do you actually know French? If you don't know the Paris version of French, and Paris is of course the capital of France, do you in fact know French? And I think the answer is probably no. And so we're getting kind of a funny little snapshot of the Prioress. It says she knows French, but that seems to in fact not be true. So it is a bit ironic. She really doesn't know French. She might even be pretending to know French. And so what inferences can we make about her based on that? Well, as I mentioned earlier, French was the language of the government. It was the language of the upper class. And so maybe the Prioress is trying to be something she's not. Maybe she's trying to pretend to be more sophisticated than she really is. So, something very interesting there. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next quotation. It says, "She was certainly very entertaining, pleasant and friendly in her ways, and straining to counterfeit a courtly kind of grace, and to seem dignified in all her dealings." So, for my paraphrase, I wrote that she was very engaging, kind and amiable, and trying very hard to appear graceful, and to seem sophisticated and high class in everything she did. Now, of course, this is direct characterization. Chaucer is just very directly telling us what she's like. Now, as I went to make my inferences, I focused on a couple of words. I focused on this word straining and also this word counterfeit. Now, straining, when we think of that word, we think of someone trying very, very hard to accomplish something. It's really difficult. They're working hard. They're straining to achieve a goal, but it's difficult for them, and maybe they're falling short of their goal. And that next word, counterfeit, of course we think of counterfeiting money. That's what comes to mind first. And so we know that counterfeit means fake. She's kind of faking a courtly kind of grace. She's faking gracefulness. She's trying to seem dignified, but is she really dignified? I don't know. Another word that's a bit interesting is this word courtly. When we think of courts, especially in medieval England, we think of, the lords and ladies that would hang out at court. And so to be courtly was to be high class. And so she's working so hard to pretend to be the grace and the beauty and the charm that a courtly lady might have. And yet our Prioress is just falling a little short of her goal. So those were the inferences that I made over here where it says, what do these diction choices, straining and counterfeit, suggest? Moving on, we're going to start with the third quotation. It says, "She used to weep if she but saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bleeding. And she had little dogs she would be feeding with roasted flesh or milk or fine white bread." Now, this is probably my favorite quotation. I think it's very funny. So let's look at the paraphrase first. I wrote, "She cried when mice were stuck in traps or when they died or suffered. She had dogs that she fed cooked meat with milk and bread." Now, of course, this is indirect characterization. We're learning about her behavior. And let's go back here as we begin to make our inferences. So, something that I think is interesting, she's crying when she sees these dead mice. It's so sad to her. So we could infer that she's a very caring individual. She has a tender heart. But then we get down here and it says she had these little dogs. So again, she's an animal lover. She cares for others. But what did she feed her dogs? It says that she fed her dogs roasted flesh. Now let's focus in on that diction choice, flesh. That's really significant. Why did Chaucer use that word? Why didn't he just call it meat, or maybe chicken, or lamb, or whatever it was? Well, flesh is a very graphic word. And so let's think about the irony here. She's crying over the mice because she can't bear that a living creature would die. It's so sad to her. But in the next moment, what does she feed her dogs? Well, the answer is she feeds them some dead animal, the roasted flesh of another animal. So it's incredibly ironic. She's crying over these dead mice in 1 minute, and the next minute she's killing another animal to feed her precious little dogs. Hopefully you all can see the inconsistencies. And this is where Chaucer's humor and his satire really show through. It's funny. It makes us laugh because it's so ridiculous. We've got that irony, the expectation, and then the reality. They're very different things. So those are the inferences that I was able to make. Perhaps this prioress is a bit hypocritical, and she's trying to be something that she's not once again. Okay, if we move along to this final quotation, this is another really good one. It says, "She wore a coral trinket on her arm, a set of beads, whence hung a golden brooch of brightest sheen, on which there first was graven a crowned A, and lower amor vincit omnia." So I'm going to go ahead and show you my paraphrase. It says, "She wore a bracelet on her arm made of beads. On the bracelet there was a shiny gold charm that was engraved with an A, and love conquers all." So I've just got my line-by-line paraphrase. And something I want to point out that I haven't mentioned before is these little slash marks. Just a reminder from last year that these slash marks signify line breaks in the text. And so I'm doing a line-by-line interpretation, and so I use those slash marks to show where the lines break in the original text. That way I can be consistent with what Chaucer's lines are. So that's my paraphrase, and of course, this is indirect characterization. It's just describing her clothing, and we are going to make some inferences based on this description of her clothing. Now, as we go to make our inferences, the question says, is the prioress's bracelet consistent with her station in life? So we're going to move back over to the quotation. And it says, "She wore a coral trinket on her arm, a set of beads." Now, immediately when you hear those words, set of beads, what do you think of? So what do you think of when you hear about a nun wearing a set of beads? Well, of course, what comes to mind is a rosary, right? If we hear that a nun has a set of beads, we assume it's got to be a rosary. And this is where Chaucer starts to play with us, because is it a rosary? No, it's absolutely not. It says, "Whence hung a golden brooch of brightest sheen." So it's a golden brooch, and a brooch is like a trinket, like a little charm. And so we know it's not a rosary. It's also gold, which is very flashy for a nun. And on this charm, there was an engraved letter A, and then also these words, amor vincit omnia, which from the paraphrase and from our footnotes, we know means love conquers all. Now, does this sound like the type of bracelet a nun should be wearing? Probably not. It's a little bit flashy for a nun, and I think that these words, amor vincit omnia, love conquers all, I think they're a little bit suspect. I don't think she's talking about God's love here. I think she's probably talking about, the love that you read about in these courtly romances, which were very popular at the time, the knight saving the damsel in distress, that kind of romantic, over-the-top, passionate love. So again, we see the prioress not behaving the way that she ought to based on her station in life. So now that we've looked at these quotations, we've made some inferences, we're going to move into the post-analysis. So the question says, the prioress is trying very hard to appear a certain way. Why? What are the prioress's motivations? Who or what does she strive to be like? And I think at this point the answer is that she strives to be just like those ladies that she sees in the courts, these upper-class women that are living these wonderfully exciting lives. It seems pretty obvious at this point that the prioress is unhappy with her station in life, and she's trying to seem a bit more sophisticated, a bit more dainty than she really is. So with that, we're going to move into this last part. We're going to write an assertion about Chaucer's use of the prioress. So it says, how does Chaucer use the prioress as a social commentary? And again, a social commentary is when the author is using the text to make a very critical point about some of the flaws in some aspect of society. And in this case, Chaucer is talking about, of course, medieval English society. You're going to write an assertion that states what Chaucer is trying to reveal through the prioress. Consider what Chaucer might be saying about women, specifically women in the clergy. Does Chaucer think that women are, really cut out for the clergy? Or does he think differently? What does he think that women are motivated by? Things like that. Those are some things that we could put into our assertions. And remember, of course, that assertions address those big picture ideas. So what I want you to do now is pause the video and go ahead and write your assertion. So Chaucer uses the Prioress, or you could get more specific. Chaucer uses direct or indirect characterization of the Prioress to suggest what? Go ahead and pause the video now. I'd like to take a moment to share with you the assertion that I wrote. Now, this is by no means a perfect assertion, and it's of course not the only correct one. But I wrote, Chaucer uses indirect characterization of the Prioress to suggest that women are too superficial and vain to faithfully serve God as members of the clergy. So this assertion has all the necessary components. I have a literary device. I'm talking about really this topic of women, and then I have Chaucer's stance on that topic, that women are too superficial to successfully and faithfully serve God. And of course, that's a debatable point. That's a debatable argument, and it's unique. He didn't say that in the text. I had to kind of think and critically analyze the text in order to come to that conclusion. And of course, the best assertions are a little bit debatable, as long as you can support them. So this one works, and if you have any questions about yours, I would be happy to look at them when I return to class. Next, we're going to just briefly discuss the wife of Bath, and we're not going to spend quite as much time on the wife of Bath because she is a bit easier to understand. So that pre-analysis question says, how do you imagine a proper medieval lady should look and or behave? Now, of course, we think that a proper medieval lady should be very kind, probably a little bit quiet, not too loud or obnoxious, and a proper medieval lady, especially a wife, would probably be subservient to her husband. She would be all about serving her husband in whatever he needed. So kind of interesting. That's what we think a wife in medieval times should act like, and we'll see if the wife of Bath lives up to that. So what I want you to do right now is pause the video for really only about 2, maybe 5 minutes, and find 2 examples of direct characterization and 2 examples of indirect characterization of the wife of Bath. So you're going to need to open up the text on your iPad to do this and look at your annotations that you completed for homework. After that, I'm going to show you some examples that I found, and we are going to look at maybe what this tells us about the wife of Bath. Okay, so for direct characterization, I looked at a couple of things. And some of these are not exactly directly quoted from the text. I kind of did my best to remember the quotes, but some of them may not be quite perfect. First, I saw that Chaucer describes her as having gap teeth set widely, so she's not exactly the best-looking woman. She's also described as somewhat deaf, so she can't really hear what you're saying. She probably talks pretty loudly if she's deaf because, she's not hearing people correctly. So already we have this image of this gap-toothed woman who's yelling at people because she can't hear them. So it's a little bit funny. We see that satire. We're giggling a bit at this woman. She also has large hips, so she's not a tiny woman by any means. And then she was bold. Her face was bold. It was also handsome and red in hue. So when I hear that phrase red in hue, I picture her as maybe a little bit out of breath. She's bold. She's in your face. This is a woman who is not afraid to be herself. And she's not good looking, but that doesn't seem to stop her. Moving on to indirect characterization. We have a few things here. It says that she had 5 husbands, and this is scandalous. For a woman in the medieval period to have 5 husbands is pretty unbelievable. So maybe she's a gold digger. I mean, it's not that hard to imagine that she could be. And we have to ask ourselves why she has had 5 husbands. Maybe they were a lot older than her and they died. Maybe they died in the Crusades. Maybe they died of illness. There are really many possibilities here, but it's interesting, to say the least, that she had 5 husbands. At the very end, it also, it says that, love was an art in which she knew the oldest dances. So she knows a lot about love. And And again, that's a little scandalous. So maybe she's manipulative. Maybe she's able to control men. She knows sort of what to do to get a man. It's a little bit interesting. Also, it says that she traveled a lot. She went to Jerusalem and Rome, and so we know she has to be wealthy because in order to travel that much, you would need a lot of money. And she's probably adventurous as well. She's not afraid to leave her home and go off on her own. We also know that she's jealous, and I made this inference based on a quote towards the beginning about the altar. Now, I went ahead and typed up this altar quotation for you. It's a little bit small, but I think you'll be able to see it. It says, "In all the parish not a dame dared stir towards the altar steps in front of her. And if indeed they did, so wrath was she as to be quite put out of charity." And this comes from the beginning of the section about the wife of Bath. Now, we know that a parish is a church, and we know that a dame is a girl. And we know that wrath means angry, and of course charity means kindness. And so basically what it's saying is that in the whole church, no girl dared to stir or move towards the altar steps in front of her. Now, what does that mean? I don't think that the wife of Bath is just getting mad because some girl beat her to the front of the church to get communion. Why are these girls going to the front of the church? And the answer is that this is kind of a euphemism. It's a way of implying marriage. So if any girl dared to beat her to the altar, to beat her to marriage, then the wife of Bath would be furious. She would show her wrath. And she would be quite put out of charity. She would lose all of her kindness. And so we see that the wife of Bath is a little jealous. She's obsessed with marriage and men and getting what she wants. So very interesting. Now, I know that this has been quite a long video, but we are about to the end. The next question says, is the wife of Bath like a typical medieval woman? And of course, she's not. She really defies all of our expectations. She's much more bold than we would expect of a woman like that. And so lastly, you're going to write another assertion about the wife of Bath this time. So what social commentary is Chaucer expressing through the wife of Bath? You're going to write an assertion. You can write it in the space on your paper. And I'm actually not going to go over it in the video, but we can discuss it next class if you would like. But consider what Chaucer might be saying about women through the wife of Bath. What does Chaucer think of women? Does he think they should be bold? Does he think that being bold might get them in trouble? What does he think that women are obsessed with? What do we see that the wife of Bath is obsessed with? So think about those things, write an assertion, and I will talk to you next class. I hope you've enjoyed our study of the Canterbury Tales today.